She hasn't held a real job in over a decade, and now she's draining her dead mother's accounts like it's her inheritance.
That's what my father said under oath, his voice echoing through a courtroom filled with people who had watched me grow up and chosen to forget me. I didn't react. I didn't look at him. I lifted the paper cup in front of me and took a slow sip. It tasted stale flat, metallic-like. It had been sitting in old pipes long before this courthouse ever saw a fresh coat of paint. I placed it back down carefully without a sound. My name is Emily Carter, 38 years old. Medium height, lean build, dark brown hair pulled into a low, precise knot at the nape of my neck. My face is composed, almost unreadable. Something people often mistake for coldness. It isn't. It's control. Years of working in high-stakes environments had stripped away unnecessary emotion. You don't survive in my world if you wear your feelings on your sleeve. Across the courtroom stood my father, Thomas Carter. Thomas was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s. His silver-streaked hair, always perfectly combed, his jaw set in permanent authority. He had built his life as a respected local businessman in Richmond, Virginia, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and expected loyalty in return. To the town, he was dependable. To his family, he was immovable. Years ago, after losing a major business contract that nearly ruined him, he became harder, less patient, more controlling. Failure, to him, was something to crush before it spread. And today, I was the failure. To this day, Thomas continued, his voice steady, commanding, my daughter cannot provide a single piece of evidence that she has earned an honest living. A murmur rippled through the gallery. To his right sat Ryan Carter, my younger brother, 28, tall, slightly slouched, with sandy blonde hair that fell carelessly over his forehead. He had kind eyes, once still did, maybe, but they were clouded now, uncertain. Ryan had always been the peacemaker, the one who avoided conflict. After Mom got sick, that changed. He stayed. I didn't. And in our father's eyes, that difference meant everything. Ryan didn't look at me, not once. At the plaintiff's table stood Daniel Brooks, my father's attorney. Early 40s, slim, sharp-featured, with a voice polished by years in court. He carried himself with quiet arrogance, the kind that comes from rarely being challenged. His suit was immaculate. His smile practiced. He believed in facts, the kind that could be printed, stamped, and filed. And I had none. No records, no online presence, no proof. Because proof in my line of work was a liability. Miss Carter, Daniel said, turning toward me, his tone deceptively polite. Can you provide this court with any documentation of employment? A pay stub? A tax return? Anything that demonstrates a legitimate source of income? I met his gaze. My work requires discretion, I replied evenly. A faint smile touched his lips. Victory. Premature. Of course it does. In the back row, a camera flashed. Local reporters leaned forward, eager. Tomorrow's headlines were already writing themselves. Local woman accused of defrauding family estate. I lowered my eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in calculation. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought absence meant nothing. They had no idea how wrong they were. By the time the court recessed for lunch, the story had already taken on a life of its own, and it wasn't mine anymore. It was his. Thomas Carter didn't just accuse, he constructed. Every word he spoke fit into a clean, convincing narrative. A hard-working father, a loyal son, and a daughter who abandoned both. He stood near the aisle now, speaking quietly with his attorney, his posture relaxed, almost satisfied. This was familiar territory for him, control, perception, reputation. He didn't need truth, he needed consistency, and he had built it well. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching the room empty. People avoided eye contact as they passed, not out of cruelty, but certainty. They believed they understood me now. That was the most dangerous part, outside the courtroom. As the hallway buzzed with low conversations and the faint clicking of cameras, a woman stepped into my path. Linda Graves, mid-50s, short, with tightly curled grey hair and sharp, observant eyes. She was a local reporter for the Richmond Chronicle, known for her persistence and instinct for scandal. Her tone was polite, but her gaze was surgical. Emily Carter, she asked, do you have any comment regarding the allegations that you fabricated your employment history? I don't comment on active cases, I replied. She tilted her head slightly, studying me. People say you disappeared for years. No job records, no community ties. That's unusual. Unusual doesn't mean untrue, I said, then walked past her before she could press further. At the far end of the hall stood Ryan. He looked smaller out here, less certain. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his wrinkled blazer, shoulders slightly hunched. When he finally met my eyes, there was something there. Guilt, maybe. Or confusion. He said, his voice low. I stopped. But didn't move closer. Ryan Carter had always been the softer one. Even as a kid, he avoided conflict, choosing silence over confrontation. But life had reshaped him. After Mom's illness drained their finances, he stayed behind to help Dad manage what was left of the family business. The pressure hardened him, not into strength, but into dependence. You could have just told us, he continued. If things were bad, we would have helped. I almost smiled at that. You mean Dad would have helped? I asked quietly. Ryan hesitated. That was answer enough. I didn't steal anything, I said. He looked down. That's not what the statements show. Of course it wasn't, because the version of me he knew had already been rewritten. Behind him, Thomas stepped out of the courtroom, his presence immediate and commanding. Ryan straightened instinctively, like gravity had shifted. Ryan, Thomas said, not even acknowledging me. We need to speak with Daniel. Ryan nodded quickly and followed. I watched them go. A perfect alignment, a perfect narrative. Across the street, inside a small coffee shop, another perspective was beginning to form. Jake Miller sat by the window, his laptop open, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. 39, slightly unshaven, with dark hair that refused to stay combed and a habit of leaning too close to whatever he was focused on. He used to be a systems analyst before shifting into freelance investigative work, less stable, more dangerous, but better suited to his curiosity. He frowned at the screen. No employment records, no tissues, no digital footprint. That's not normal, he muttered. Jake wasn't looking for proof of failure. He was looking for the pattern behind the absence, and that was something entirely different. The silence in the hallway followed me long after I stepped outside the courthouse. It clung not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. The kind of silence that forms when people think they already know who you are. They didn't. They couldn't. I walked toward the parking structure, my steps measured, controlled. Emily Carter, 38, composed as always medium height, lean frame, movements precise enough to seem almost mechanical. People often mistook that for detachment. It wasn't. It was discipline carved over years. Years of working in rooms where one wrong decision didn't just cost money, it shifted systems, lives, sometimes entire networks, and none of it could ever be spoken out loud. Inside my car, I closed the door and let the world mute itself. For a moment I allowed my eyes to close, not in exhaustion but in recalibration. But the courtroom was one kind of battlefield. My real work existed in another. A memory surfaced, uninvited. 3 years ago. A secured operations floor in Arlington. Windowless. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. Lines of code scrolling faster than most people could read. I had been sitting at a terminal, shoulders tense, fingers moving without hesitation. A coordinated cyber attack targeting multiple regional banks, sophisticated, layered, designed to collapse transaction integrity within minutes. Most analysts would have panicked. I didn't, because panic wastes time. I traced the breach vector, identified the false routing nodes, and deployed a counter sequence that rerouted the malicious traffic back into a contained loop. 6 minutes. That's all it took. 6 minutes to stop millions from disappearing. 6 minutes that never existed on any public record. I opened my eyes. That was my life. Invisible victories, unseen consequences. A soft knock on the driver's side window broke the memory. I turned. Lucas Reed. He stood there, tall, just over 6 feet, with a quiet, grounded presence that didn't demand attention, but held it anyway. Early 40s, short dark hair touched with grey at the temples, clean-shaven, eyes sharp but calm. He wore a simple charcoal coat, nothing remarkable, which was exactly the point. Lucas had the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it, an advantage in his line of work. He had been my handler for the past 8 years, and one of the few people who actually knew who I was. I unlocked the door. He slipped into the passenger seat without a word. You handled that well, he said, voice low, steady. They think I'm a ghost, I replied. Lucas allowed a faint smile. You are, just not in the way they understand. He placed a slim folder on the dashboard, but didn't open it. Bush, things are escalating faster than expected, he continued. There's movement on your case, internal. I glanced at the folder, but didn't touch it. Too soon? Maybe, he said. But if they push harder, we may not have a choice. A choice, that word lingered, because I had already made mine, years ago. Another memory surfaced, quieter this time. Late night, a small apartment, laptop open, banking interface glowing against the dark. I had stared at the numbers for a long time before transferring the funds. $136,000, not to my account, not directly to them, through layers, shell paths, and anonymous channels. Enough to stabilize the farm after the irrigation system failed. Enough to keep my father from losing everything he had built. He never knew. He never asked, because accepting help didn't fit the story he had written about me. I've been funding them for years, I said quietly. Medical bills, Ryan's tuition, everything. Lucas nodded once. Ah, I know. And now they think I'm stealing from them. That's the cost, he said, of being invisible. I leaned back in the seat, eyes fixed forward. No, I said after a moment. That's the cost of letting them believe it. Lucas studied me carefully, as if measuring something unspoken. You're thinking about ending the silence. I didn't answer, because the truth was already there, waiting. The courtroom felt different when I walked back in that afternoon, tighter, heavier. Like the air itself had turned against me. The whispers were gone. In their place was something worse. Certainty. They had decided who I was. I took my seat without hesitation. Same posture, same stillness. Emily Carter controlled, composed, unreadable. But beneath that still surface, something was shifting, not cracking, not yet, but bending under pressure that had finally become personal. At the plaintiff's table, Daniel Brooks stood with a new kind of energy, sharper, more aggressive. He adjusted his cufflinks, his thin lips pressed into a confident line. He had found something, or at least something he believed would end this. Your Honor, Daniel began, his voice steady and precise.
The plaintiff would like to submit additional evidence regarding unauthorized withdrawals from the late Margaret Carter's personal accounts. Margaret Carter, my mother.
Even hearing her name used like that formal, distant felt wrong. Daniel turned slightly, signaling to an assistant, who stepped forward with a stack of documents. We have here a series of transactions conducted over a 3-year period. Significant amounts, repeated withdrawals, and most importantly, signatures that have been examined by a certified forensic specialist. He paused. Forgeries. The word landed exactly as intended. A ripple passed through the room. I didn't move, didn't react. But something inside me tightened. Daniel continued, pacing slowly. These funds, Your Honor, were taken while Mrs. Carter was in declining health, vulnerable, dependent, which raises a very serious question. Who had both the access and the motive? His eyes settled on me. The answer in his version of the story was obvious. Across the room,
Ryan shifted in his seat. I saw it this time. The hesitation, the doubt. Ryan Carter, 28,
worn down in ways that didn't show at first glance.
His clothes were neat but inexpensive.
His posture slightly collapsed inward, like he had been carrying too much for too long. Responsibility had aged him early. After Mom's illness, he had taken over parts of the business he was never ready for. Numbers, debts, expectations, none of it came naturally to him. But something else didn't sit right either. His eyes flicked back to the documents, again and again. Later, during a brief pause in proceedings, he leaned toward Daniel, speaking in a low voice. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the tension in his jaw. Because he recognized something, the pattern, the timing. Those transactions weren't random. They lined up too cleanly with the mom's condition worsened, with the periods when outside help quietly appeared, nurses, medication.
It's equipment that Thomas had never agreed to pay for. Ryan wasn't stupid. He just hadn't looked closely before. Across town, Jake Miller was doing exactly that. His laptop screen glowed in the dim corner of his apartment, lines of financial data scattered across multiple windows. Jake leaned forward, brow furrowed, fingers tapping restlessly against the desk. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. The transfers were real. The accounts existed. But the origin points, those were buried, layered, routed through small, nearly invisible channels that most people would ignore. But Jake didn't ignore patterns. And this one was too precise. He pulled up another file, an archived scholarship fund tied to Ryan's university, anonymous donor, no listed origin. Then another medical payments routed through a private care provider. Same structure, same timing. Jake exhaled slowly. Someone's been funding this family, he said under his breath, and it's not who they think. Back in the courtroom,
Daniel's voice cut through the air again, sharper now. The evidence is clear, he said.
Miss Carter not only failed to support her family, she exploited her mother's condition for financial gain. The final push. The breaking point. For the first time, I felt it. Not fear, not panic, but something far more dangerous. Fatigue. The kind that seeps into your bones when you've carried a truth no one is willing to hear. Because every word I could say, every explanation, every defense would sound like a lie. I looked down at my hands, still steady, still controlled, but for a brief, fleeting moment, I wondered what it would feel like to just stop, to let them win, to walk away from a fight I wasn't allowed to finish. Then I lifted my head again and said nothing. The courtroom had crossed the line. It was no longer about suspicion, it was about conclusion, the kind that settles into people's minds and refuses to move, no matter what comes next. I sat in silence as Daniel Brooks returned to his seat, satisfied, his expression composed but sharpened by quiet triumph. He believed the case was already over. To him, this was just the formal process of confirming what everyone now accepted as truth. Emily Carter, fraud, failure, thief. I could feel the weight of it pressing in from every direction. Then a chair shifted beside me. Marcus Hale stood. He hadn't spoken much until now. That had been intentional.
Marcus Hale was a man in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm presence that didn't rely on volume to command attention. His dark suit was understated, his posture precise. His face line, slightly at the edges, carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades operating under pressure.
Before private practice, he had served in federal legal divisions dealing with cases most people would never even hear about. He didn't waste words, he didn't perform, he prepared. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice steady, measured. The defense would like to address the court regarding the nature of the evidence presented. Daniel exhaled softly, almost amused. Counselor, unless your client can produce actual documentation. Marcus didn't look at him. This documentation exists, he said calmly. However, it falls under restricted federal classification. That shifted the room, not dramatically, but enough. A pause, a flicker of uncertainty. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting, the judge said slowly, that this court is missing material evidence due to national security restrictions? I am, Marcus replied. Up across the room, Thomas Carter's posture stiffened. For the first time, something disrupted his control. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. Marcus continued, we are formally requesting permission to submit a limited disclosure reviewable only by the court regarding Miss Carter's verified employment status and financial capabilities. Daniel let out a short laugh. This is a civil case, not a classified operation. You expect this court to accept that your client's entire life is invisible. Marcus finally turned his head slightly. Yes, the word landed without force, but it carried weight, because it wasn't an argument, it was a statement. At the back of the room, Ryan shifted again, but this time he didn't look at Daniel. He looked at me, really looked, because something had finally clicked. Hours earlier, during a break, he had stepped outside, pulling up old emails on his phone, financial notices from his university. Tuition payments confirmed. On time. Every semester. He had always assumed they came from loans or delayed family funds, but there were no loans, no records tied to Thomas. Just one line he had never questioned before. External scholarship contribution. Anonymous source. Ryan's face had gone pale, because now he had seen the pattern, the same timing, the same structure, the same invisible hand. Back in the courtroom, his fingers tightened slightly against the bench. Across from him, Thomas noticed. Ryan, he muttered under his breath, low and sharp. Stay focused. But Ryan didn't answer, because for the first time he wasn't sure what the truth was supposed to be anymore. At the front, Daniel stepped forward again, attempting to regain control. Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. The defense is introducing ambiguity where there is none. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his briefcase, slowly, deliberately. He didn't take anything out yet. But the gesture alone shifted the room again, because now, even without seeing it, everyone understood there was something more, something that didn't fit the narrative. Thomas Carter leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. His confidence hadn't disappeared, but it had cracked, just enough to let something else through. Concern. But still, he held on to his version of reality, because letting go meant admitting he had been wrong. And Thomas Carter did not do that. Not easily. I sat there, still silent, still composed, but no longer alone in what I knew. The truth wasn't visible yet, but it was closer. The room didn't breathe when Marcus Hale finally opened the briefcase. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden movement, no raised voice, but the stillness that followed felt deliberate, controlled, like everyone instinctively understood that something irreversible was about to happen. Emily Carter remained seated, posture unchanged, her expression calm, almost detached, but her eyes sharper now, focused. This was the moment she had spent years avoiding, not because she feared exposure, but because exposure came with consequences no one in that room could comprehend. Marcus removed a single sealed envelope, matte black, unmarked except for a faint embossed insignia that only a handful of people in the country would recognize. He didn't hold it up for effect. He simply stepped forward and placed it in the judge's hands. This document, Marcus said evenly, has been authorized for limited judicial review under federal clearance. It verifies my client's continuous employment and financial capability over the past decade. Daniel Brooks stepped forward immediately, tension now visible in the tightness of his jaw. Your Honor, I object. We have no way to verify the legitimacy of... You don't, Marcus interrupted quietly. But the court does. That ended it. The judge, a man in his late 50s named Harold Whitaker, tall, slightly stooped from years on the bench with thinning grey hair and a reputation for strict adherence to procedure, took the envelope with careful hands. He had seen a lot in his career, fraud, deception, manipulation, but this was different. He could feel it. The seal broke with a soft, deliberate sound. The courtroom leaned forward as one. Whitaker read silently at first, then again. His expression changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The neutrality of a judge gave way, slowly, to something heavier. Recognition, understanding. When he finally looked up, his gaze didn't go to Marcus.
It went to me. "Miss Carter," he said, voice measured but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "This court has received verified confirmation of your employment status." A pause. No one moved. "You are currently operating as a senior-level cybersecurity specialist within a classified national security division." The silence shattered, not loudly, but deeply. A collective shift, like the ground itself, had tilted. Daniel stepped back, his composure slipping for the first time. That's not possible. There's no record." "There wouldn't be," Whitaker said, cutting him off. "That is the point." Across the room, Thomas Carter froze. Completely. His broad frame, once so steady, now rigid in a way that wasn't strength. It was shock.
The certainty that had defined him all day evaporated in seconds, replaced by something far more fragile. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me.
Maybe for the first time, he actually didn't. Ryan reacted differently. Ryan Carter didn't freeze. He collapsed inward, not physically, but emotionally. His shoulders dropped, his breathing uneven. His mind was racing, connecting everything he had ignored before. The tuition payments, the timing, the unexplained support. His eyes found mine, and this time there was no doubt, only realization. "You," he whispered, barely audible. "It was you." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. In the back of the courtroom, Jake Miller stood up slowly. He had been leaning against the wall, observing, analyzing as always, but now there was something else in his expression. Certainty. Not just about the data, but about me. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. "I knew it didn't add up to." For Jake, this wasn't just confirmation, it was validation.
As everything he had seen, the patterns, the gaps, the invisible structure behind the numbers finally made sense, and he made a decision right there. He wasn't just going to observe anymore. He was on my side. Outside, the shift had already begun. Reporters who had once leaned forward with suspicion were now scrambling, whispering urgently into phones, rewriting headlines in real time, from fraud to something else entirely. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitaker placed the document down carefully. "The absence of public records," he continued, "is not evidence of failure in this case. It is evidence of classified service." Every word dismantled the narrative that had been built against me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of it. I remained still, but something inside me, something I had held in place for years, finally settled. Not relief, not victory, recognition. The silence after the revelation didn't last long. It broke the moment Judge Whitaker straightened in his chair, his voice returning to the firm, procedural tone that had defined the courtroom before. But now, it carried something colder. Finality. "This court finds no basis for the allegations of fraud brought against Miss Emily Carter," he stated, each word deliberate. "The claims are dismissed with prejudice." The sound of it dismissed echoed harder than any accusation had. Daniel Brooks didn't move at first. Then slowly, almost mechanically, he lowered his gaze. His earlier confidence completely stripped away. His sharp features now looked drawn, his posture slightly collapsed. For a man who built his career on certainty, this kind of public unraveling would follow him long after today. Furthermore, Whitaker continued, "The court finds that the plaintiff, Thomas Carter, pursued these claims with insufficient evidence and clear disregard for the defendant's reputation.
Financial penalties will be imposed accordingly." That was when it hit. Not just the case, but the consequences. Thomas Carter stood frozen, his broad frame suddenly looking heavier, older. The authority that once defined him had fractured, leaving behind something raw and exposed. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was already slipping through his fingers. In a town like this, perception wasn't temporary, it was permanent. People were watching him now, the same way they had watched me earlier. Judging, rewriting. Across the aisle, whispers had already begun. I remained seated, unmoving, but my eyes shifted briefly, not to my father, not to the judge, but to Ryan. He was already looking at me. Ryan Carter didn't hesitate this time. He stood quickly, almost too quickly, like if he waited even a second longer, he might lose the courage entirely. His steps toward me were uneven, uncertain.
"Emily," he said, his voice rough, stripped of everything it had carried before: defensiveness, doubt, distance. Now it held only truth. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear I didn't know." Up close I could see it clearly. The exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he had been carrying, not just from the business, but from years of trying to meet expectations he never chose. "He told me," Ryan continued, glancing briefly toward Thomas before looking back at me, "Dad said you left, that you didn't care, that everything we had left depended on me staying, fixing things." His jaw tightened. I thought I was protecting the family. There it was. Not betrayal, manipulation. Ryan had never been strong enough to challenge Thomas, not because he lacked character, but because he had been shaped to depend on approval he never fully received. "I was wrong," he said quietly. I studied him for a moment. Ryan Carter, 28, still searching for something solid to stand on. Not weak, just
unsteady. You were misled, I said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. Behind him, Thomas hadn't moved. Not toward us, not away. He stood alone now, his isolation more visible than any punishment the court could assign. People avoided him as they filed out, their earlier respect replaced by cautious distance. A man built on certainty, now surrounded by doubt. For the first time in my life, he didn't try to speak, didn't try to control, because there was nothing left to control. I stood slowly. The room felt different now, not lighter but clearer. The story had been corrected, but that didn't mean it could be undone. As I walked toward the exit, I felt Ryan's gaze follow me, hopeful, uncertain, waiting. And for a moment I paused, not turning back, just thinking, because walking away from the lie was easy. Walking away from everything else, that was harder. Outside the air felt sharper, cleaner. Reporters gathered at a distance, their tone no longer accusatory, but curious, almost respectful. A shift in narrative always came with a shift in tone, but I didn't stop for them. Didn't slow down, because for the first time the question wasn't about who I was to them. It was about who I wanted to be next, and whether this place, this family still had a role in that answer. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a quiet finality that felt heavier than the verdict itself. The case was over, the truth had been exposed. But what remained was something far more complicated, what came after. I stood at the edge of the parking lot for a moment, the morning light settling over everything with a kind of calm indifference. For years I had lived in shadows by necessity, invisible by design. But standing there, Emily Carter 38, composed, sharp, and no longer hidden, I realized something had shifted. Not in the world, in me. Emily, Ryan's voice came from behind, softer this time, careful. I turned. He looked different. Not physically still tall, slightly slouched, that same uncertain posture, but something in his expression had steadied. The confusion was still there, but now it was mixed with intention.
But he had made a choice. I meant what I said, he continued, stepping closer, about being wrong. There was no defensiveness in his tone now. No excuses. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, he added. I just want a chance to do something right. I studied him. Ryan Carter had spent most of his life reacting, adapting to pressure, expectations, control. But this was the first time he was stepping forward on his own, not for approval, for accountability. There is something you can do, I said. He nodded immediately, ready. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded document, simple, unmarked. There's a scholarship fund, I explained. Unofficial. I've been running it quietly for years. Students who fall through the cracks. No recognition, no publicity. Ryan took the paper carefully, like it mattered. Help me make it real, I said, public, transparent, something that doesn't have to hide. For a moment he just stared at the page, and then he looked up. I will, he said. And this time, I believed him. A few steps away, leaning casually against the dark sedan, Jake Miller watched the exchange. He pushed himself off the car and walked over, hands in his pockets, that familiar half-smirk on his face. 39, slightly disheveled as always, but with eyes that missed nothing. Jake had always lived somewhere between curiosity and conviction, and now he had found something worth committing to. So, he said lightly, glancing between us, turns out you're not exactly who I thought you were. Most people don't get that right, I replied. He nodded once. Good. Makes things interesting. Jake wasn't intrusive. He didn't ask questions. He knew I couldn't answer. That was part of why I trusted him. He understood boundaries without needing them explained. I could help with the fund, he added. Structure, visibility, making sure it actually reaches people who need it. Ryan looked at him, then back at me. Oh, seems like we're building something, Jake said. For the first time in a long while, the word we didn't feel like a liability. Behind us, the courthouse remained unchanged. Solid, permanent. A place where stories ended. But this wasn't an ending, not really. I glanced back once, not at the building, not at the past, but at the space it represented. Then I turned away. Dad? Ryan asked quietly. I paused. Thomas Carter remained inside that world, his world where control mattered more than understanding, where narratives were chosen, not questioned. I'm not going back, I said. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even rejection. It was distance, necessary, final. Ryan nodded slowly, accepting it, and that was enough. I walked toward my car, the keys cool in my hand, the weight of years no longer pressing against my shoulders. For 15 years I had lived a life no one could see, a life defined by silence, by sacrifice, by invisibility, but not anymore. I wasn't a ghost, I wasn't a version of someone else's story. I was the one writing it now, and this time I didn't need to disappear to make it matter. Truth doesn't need to be loud to shine. When you are misunderstood, remember that God sees every silent sacrifice you make. At the right time, He will bring your truth into the light. That is the miracle. If you believe this, comment Amen to receive blessings. Don't forget to share and subscribe to spread meaningful stories.